Hi, it's Lit Lessons with GCSE Memes. Today we're looking at the character of Dr. Jekyll from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. A novella by Robert Louis Stevenson that many of you will be doing for your exams. We'll be doing some analysis of the start, the middle, and the end of the text, and where we see Dr. Jekyll in those and how he's presented, before we think about why he's presented this way and why the character is led through this kind of development arc that we see. Before we do any of that though, and before we start looking at the key quotes and the different sections, I thought it's important for us to think about who the character of Dr. Jekyll is. And straight away, I think it's important for us to revisit what we already know and develop on our thinking about it. Okay, now the first thing that we know about Dr. Jekyll, and the first thing I think about when I thought about him, was this: that he's a physician. Now, having done a bit of research online, I know that physicians are the most respectable of all of the doctors in Victorian times. They were split, the doctors in Victorian times, into a hierarchy, and physicians were right at the top of that hierarchy as being seen as the most prestigious and most respected. So immediately Dr. Jekyll is someone who's respectable and has a good reputation, and that's only made more relevant when we think about the fact that he inherited a large fortune, he was well brought up, and the fact that he is that as well makes him even more of someone who has a reputation that is one of respectability, and one that he has to maintain as well. As well as this, he is someone who, in spite of the fact that he has got a lot of money inherited, is still ambitious enough to push his research in science into what we would call unethical territory. There was a lot of science coming out during the Victorian times that was kind of questioning the existence of God. If we think about Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, for example, and a lot of this science was seen as quite unethical, and Dr. Jekyll puts himself right on the side of the unethical scientists who are pushing the boundaries of knowledge. As well as this, he is what we would call a Victorian gentleman. Someone who is expected to behave themselves, expected to act in a certain way around sort of public grounds. As well as this, we also have this idea of him being quite a socialite, a good friend, okay, and certainly Utterson sees him as a good friend at the start of the text. And that's a final sort of piece of information that I remember about Dr. Jekyll. Now I just want to go revisit that third bullet point there, Victorian gentleman. And this is a lovely bit of context for you, because this was a belief of the Victorians that Victorian gentlemen had to act a certain way. They had to be well presented, respectable, and moral at all times. And breaking the rules of this would have ruined your reputation, your friendships, your career, which Dr. Jekyll has worked hard for. And I think because of this belief in the Victorian gentleman, people like Jekyll do want to break away from that, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why he tries to find this other side to himself, this other self in Hyde. So that's our information about Dr. Jekyll. Those things I remember. He's a physician, he's ambitious, he's a Victorian gentleman, and he's a socialite and a good friend. But let's have a look at him now more clearly in the text and actually think about some textual evidence for him. We're going to look at the first instance we really see him, and that's chapter 3. And in this chapter, we get this idea of him being good looking. And he's described as handsome and well made, but what's really important about this is in Victorian times, good morals were quite associated with someone who was good looking. If you were a good looking person, people would quite often see you as being quite a good looking person. They actually believed that you could tell a criminal just by looking at his face, and if it was a face that was one that you didn't like and was kind of ill-agreeable, it would tend to be a sign that someone was a criminal, or at least that's what they believed. So, that's the first note. He's sociable and friendly, and potentially a good friend, although we know that from his regularly hosted dinner parties that people do value him and they are described as pleasant. But we also have this very, very interesting note where Jekyll criticises Lanyon behind his back and calls him an ignorant pedant, showing that he doesn't approve of everything that Dr. Lanyon does. And in spite of the fact that this is a tactic by Jekyll to move the conversation away from Mr. Hyde, who Utterson's trying to speak to him about at this point, it still does show you that perhaps he isn't as good a friend as the others see him as. And ultimately, we do see a little bit of a flash of suspicion in him. He's described as slyish, and this is foreshadowing that there is another side to him. And the fact that he does try and hide the truth about Hyde and grows pale when Hyde is brought up, again shows you that there is something evil lurking behind the surface of Dr. Jekyll straight from the start of this text. So that's the start of the novella. Let's move on now to the middle. And in the middle of the novella, we kind of see Jekyll on and off, and he becomes quite an unpredictable figure indeed. He goes from being secluded after the murder of Danvers Carew to suddenly being really busy in the open air to being secluded once again. So he kind of disappears without a trace quite regularly through the space of these chapters. His health also is unpredictable. He's described as looking deathly sick, and at one point described himself as being very low. Again, bringing us to be concerned and bringing us to be concerned about his friend. He also seems trapped, and this is probably most evident in the incident at the window, and also in this same section he begins to break social rules. When he is at the window in chapter 7, he is described as being like a prisoner, and it seems like he's not just trapped in his house, but trapped by the situation, as we find out later that he's having uncontrollable transformations into Hyde, which shows really that he is unable to leave his house at all. As well as this, in the same chapter, as he is at that window, he stops to have a conversation with Enfield and Utterson, and stops the conversation just as it begins and slams the door in their faces of the window. And this immediately shocks Enfield and Utterson, that he breaks a societal rule, and shows once again that this figure is in a very, very bad state. Doing something like that during that time would have been pretty unheard of, and shows once again that Jekyll is going through a very, very difficult and strange time indeed. So, that's the middle of the novella. And we only start to get a real sort of sense of why Jekyll is like this and why he acts like this in chapter 10 at the end of the novella, where we see Jekyll's full statement of the case. And this is where he reveals everything that happened from his perspective, and we kind of see some filling of the gaps that Utterson's not able to fill himself. And what's really interesting about this section in my mind is that it feels almost like a confession of his sins, and it fits really nicely into the crime case file style of the novella, that we have this kind of confession from Jekyll. That being said though, not everything is negative from this statement, and he also uses it as a chance to explain his ambitions and why he even wanted to take part in these experiments in the first place. And it shows you his ambition immensely, that he was happy to play God and be unethical with his experiments. But also he says as well that he does it in an attempt to escape from the bonds of obligation, from the restrictions of being a Victorian gentleman. He likes being Hyde, in fact, because he is able to act more freely in public. He doesn't have to keep up this facade of being very respectable and reputable all the time. And indeed, this seems even more obvious that he enjoys his experiments when he actually describes himself as almost a father of Hyde, and this suggests his pride and his love for this other side of him that he's brought out as part of one of his experiments. So not only is it a chance for him to be free being Hyde, it's someone he grows to be very fond of indeed. Ultimately though, he does mention the fact that he's suffered and talks about his regrets as a result of these experiments. And this is most evident, I suppose, when it says at the end of the text, I bring the life of that unhappy Henry Jekyll to an end. So he does recognise that while it was a short-flighted enjoyment for a while, ultimately it has led to his ruin and death as well. So it's up to you at this moment in time what you do. You've just seen the start, middle and end, and where Jekyll is kind of evident mainly in those. You might decide to do either of these two green questions here. The top question can actually be split into three, and you could choose a different section of the novella for much more sort of deep revision of this character. And if you are doing that, it's up to you whether you do full paragraphs on this or a paragraph plan in general on that. If you are doing that second question though, explore how lies and deceit are used in Dr Jekyll and Mr Hyde, I would recommend you use the full text and you actually try and talk about context as well, because that's the kind of thing that you would be asked to do in an examination on Dr Jekyll and Mr Hyde. 4 questions on themes. So you've got there really 4 questions that you can either write to paragraph plans or full responses on for the character of Dr Jekyll. Now, as always, I will put in the description the full text so that you can access that, and there's nothing holding you back from having a go at this. But without further ado, here is my meme for today. And it's one that shows really how Jekyll uses Hyde to escape from sort of the trappings of society and ultimately ends up trapped even more so by Hyde's actions and the uncontrollable transformations. As always, remember to like and subscribe to this page if you haven't already. Follow our Instagram page and comment in the section below for any new content you'd like me to cover, any meme templates you'd like me to use, and anything else that you might decide to communicate with me. Thank you.